Welcome everyone to our fifth session of the Food for Thought speaker series. We're really glad to have all of you here and for joining us week after week. And we're going to keep this going. So this week we have Professor Francisco Rivera-Batiz. He's going to be discussing restarting global trade after COVID. And just a quick overview. For instructions, if you need to raise your hand during the Q&A session, you can click on the bottom left under participants to raise your hand, and we'll call on you one by one. So you'll have a chance to, any questions, comments related to the paper or related to the topic, feel free. And now we're going to start with an overview from Professor Rivera-Batiz on his paper, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So I'll hand this over to Bill because he loves to introduce our guests. And thank you, Professor, for joining us.
Yep, thank you.
Well, if I spent my time talking about all the achievements of Francisco Rivera-Batiz, it would be 1 o'clock and we'd say goodbye. Even if I just talked about his contribution to SEPA, it would take that long. But suffice it to say that he is one of the most revered professors in my 30 years of association with Columbia University. And he has done everything in SEPA, from SEPA General to PEPM, which he directed, to Teachers College, where he was also a dominant figure. I had the honor to hire several of his graduates, so he's not only great himself, he creates, some of you know I'm involved in horse racing. There are great horses, and then there are even greater broodmares and stallions. And so he'd be one of those sire of sires, if you will. And he has been the bedrock of our international and economic concentration in the EMPA program since the beginning. He's also been totally involved in our executive education programs and the design of our curriculum and participation in events like this. So if you need somebody who's great, who you can also count on, Francisco's the man. So I'm deeply grateful to him for everything he's done for us and for me. And if those of you who haven't read the paper, please read it, because as much as I like my own work, and I do, his paper is way better than mine. I'll turn it over to Francisco. Thank you again.
Well, thanks, Bill, for that fantastic introduction. I'm not sure all those things are deserved, but I'll take it, you know. So, well, let me try to provide like a 15-minute presentation overview of the paper and the issues. So let me share my PowerPoint presentation here. Is that okay? Do you see it? Is everybody?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Let me start. So this goes over a lot of the issues in the paper, but with pictures, you know, which is always always good. Let me see how I can. Okay. So we all know what is happening. So everybody can acknowledge the effects. We see it everywhere. The international organizations, on the basis of the data that they have, call these, like the IMF, a crisis like no other. And they point out that the impact, particularly on low-income households, is going to be tremendous, will increase poverty, particularly extreme poverty, over the next couple of years, not even months, years. And the consequences of all of these are beginning to surface. You have a popular and it's serious, it's sort of in the conservative side, but serious publication, The Economist, and basically they say that COVID-19 has killed globalization. So that's a pretty extreme point of view. On the other hand, you have those who disagree, who think that there will be actually a very quick recovery. That this pandemic will be like a V shaped recovery, very big drop, but then it will right away will move back up. And to support that view, I mean, there are a number of people who have voiced that view among economists, but you have Jason Furman, who is an economist, well-known economist, a professor at the Kennedy School, part of the chair of the, he was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. He has said, we are about to see the best economic data we have seen in the history of this country. So that's a pretty steep V right there. So the question, of course, is who is right? Because he has these sort of extreme viewpoints. And of course, at CEPA, I don't know, on this Jason Furman, it's a Kennedy School, so we'll see. We don't expect them to be right, So anyway, the evidence that we do have, and the serious, careful evidence is that we do have this very severe global debacle. And we expect this to continue. We have GDP for the US minus 5% for the first quarter of 2020. And it's likely to be worse the next quarter. The data that we have for unemployment is that right now it's 16.3%, at least the data for May. And it's probably much higher because there are a lot of difficulties, statistical difficulties and measurement errors when we look at unemployment. It's likely to be close, there are some estimates say it's close to actually 20%. And of course, this is not just the United States, it's everywhere. Of course, we don't have yet information for the first quarter, for the first and second quarter of 2020. We have more data for the first quarter, but for the first and second quarter, we don't have a lot of data, but the OECD has been compiling as much of the data as they can, including information for the second quarter. And this is what the picture that they have developed in the latest report, which was released about 2 weeks ago. And that includes, reductions in gross domestic product, adjusted for inflation, from the end of 2019, basically through the second quarter, through the middle of 2020. You can see huge drops in GDP from Spain and France and Italy, of course, Great Britain, Turkey, everywhere in the world, Brazil, Argentina, China. I mean, these are pretty substantial reductions in output, in production, in gross domestic product. The best forecast, and that's basically up to now, what we have seen now. Because the OECD, the data tries to show basically what has happened so far. The forecast that we have for the crisis in terms of the future also show that this crisis will persist over time. These are the figures, the forecasts by the IMF, the most recent ones. They were released, I think, last week as well. And what you see is for the advanced countries, the high-income countries, the IMF still calls them advanced countries, but anyway, the high-income countries, this is IMF, for the high-income countries, which is the blue, you see the sharp drop and then a recovery, which is slow, because you're talking about here, the last date here is the fourth quarter of 2021. It's by the end of 2021. So that's for high-income countries. Then you have emerging markets recovering according to their forecast a little bit faster. Only China, you have like a standard V recovery. But for the others, you know, it's sort of like an uppercase V, or maybe even looks more like a U than a V. These are the effects that most mainstream economies are predicting. And you wonder, well, why? And there are really two sets of effects that are embodied in these forecasts, and there are others that are even worse in terms of the implications for output, employment, and so on. The first one is that, of course, we have a sudden stop of the economy. A sudden stop, and it's everywhere, you know, basically. To some extent or another. So you have these lockdowns, you know, then this very slow period to open. And then you have the repercussions of these lockdowns. And these are repercussions that almost act like falling dominoes, you know, in terms of affecting first employment and income, and then affecting public and private sector budgets, and then growing debt, and then you have non-performing loans and financial difficulties, maybe crisis, and you know, so that goes on and on. But maybe the even more important factor, it also affects number one, but this second factor is the fact that we have so much uncertainty involved about the future. And we don't know the extent to which this will continue to spread, when will it stop, when will we have some type of vaccine, and if ever, and you know, so there are all these uncertainties about the future, and what that does is to reduce investment and reduce economic activity. You don't really invest and try to increase economic activity when you don't know if you're going to have the markets sometimes in the future. In terms of global trade, again, there's no question that we have had this tremendous drop in trade. And so this is data from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which is one of the better organizations, surprisingly, because it's the UN, but they have the best trade data, even better than the WTO. But anyway, what you see is that they are forecasting for this year, for 2020, almost a 30% contraction in trade, which would be deeper than the contraction of trade that you see during the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009. One of the sort of renowned experts on trade issues, Richard Baldwin, who teaches Geneva, he has said there will be a great trade collapse because of this crisis. So now, of course, trade, we tend to focus on goods and services, but economists usually include also capital flows as part of these international transactions. And what we have seen so far is a tremendous drop in these international transactions in terms of financial capital market transactions. So you have data here where T varies depending on the event. For example, you have the global financial crisis. So T is September 8 of 2008. And then you have 15, 30, 45, 60 days in the future after the crisis. And so you see the blue line here representing what happened after the crisis started. And of course, there you can see the drop in trade, which reaches maybe 22, 25% in terms of trading capital flows, portfolio flows, particularly to emerging markets, as you have here. But then if you look at the COVID-19 crisis, and T represents the start of the crisis, or in terms of the measurement here, is January 21st of 2020, and that's zero here. And so you see what has happened since that time in terms of the accumulated loss, because it's negative, accumulated loss of portfolio capital or financial capital in emerging markets since the start of the crisis. And you're talking about billions of dollars, close to 100 billions of dollars, and maybe even more by now. So these are pretty substantial capital outflows from, it's not just a stop, it's a capital flight from developing countries. So capital flows in general have sort of slowed down, but they've moved from some countries to other countries. And this has been especially for emerging markets. So in terms of foreign direct investments, migrant remittances, these are all aspects of trade that generate capital in developing countries. This is data from the World Bank, and it shows what they expect. See, the last date here is 2020. And basically, that means all these drops that you see here in remittances, in foreign direct investment, FDI, and in portfolio debt and capital flows, which is the green line. These are all drops that you see in financial capital flows to developing countries. And these are all highly unusual, in some cases historical drops in this flow in developing countries. Now, what are the policy responses to this clear crisis? It has already happened. We expect it to continue in the future. But you have these lockdowns and the social distancing in terms of health. We also have economic policies. Right now, most central banks are engaging in this massive quantitative easing, which is expansionary monetary policy in many different ways. The Federal Reserve is lending not just to banks, now it's preparing to lend to everybody. Maybe we can lend a loan from the Federal Reserve. And fiscal policy measures, which we all have seen. You may have received already a stimulus check. Maybe not all of us. I have. I'm very poor. You know, I don't have a lot of money, so I got the check. But anyway, it's a stimulus, fiscal stimulus package. The question is this enough? And my answer is not even close. Much more is going to be needed because the crisis keeps going on, and because of all the data and forecasts that I have given you so far. Now. Part of the problem is that this health crisis just keeps going. The pandemic is still rising, actually, in the US, in Latin America, and a number of other countries. We have hotspots emerging everywhere in different countries, even in China. You sort of a hotspot and fears that the pandemic will expand, so you have to close everything. And then, of course, we have this fear as well, uncertainty about whether there will be a second or a third round of contagion, because this has happened before. In the case of the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza in 1918 and 1919, this is data, I believe, for the United Kingdom, and these are deaths per 1,000 persons. But see, it sort of starts first, but see, the worst was like a second and even a third wave. Everybody's talking about this possible second or third wave. Of course, it's very different today from what it was at that time. But there is a lot it raises uncertainty about the future and the possibility that you will need further short-term policy initiatives, which I refer basically macroeconomic policies like monetary fiscal policies. But then you have sort of the longer-term policy initiatives, which are, I think, more challenging because they counteract things that have been happening in the past. And so the first one is that we all know, and I don't have to project, present you the data on this, but we have over the last, 20, 30 years, this really sharp increase in socioeconomic inequality. And so it may not serve, we may not see it in terms of poverty, but if you look at people above poverty, they're slightly above the poverty level. And so they're almost poor, or depending on the definition of poverty, they're still poor. And that has risen over the last 20 or 30 years. And that means that many people, particularly in developing countries and in the United States, there is no adequate access to healthcare. So this will require massive investments to protect the vulnerable and to counteract any possible continuation of this pandemic because of lack of access to health care. The second aspect of this involves social safety nets, which over the last 20, 30 years have been sort of shrinking in a number of countries. And so that would have to be reversed as well in order to prevent the impact of the pandemic on low-income populations. And then in developing countries as well, the fact is you have a huge informal sector. I mean, in some parts, in some developing countries, particularly in urban areas, you could have like 60, 70% of the population employed in the informal sector. And if they are employed in these sectors, they don't really have access to public services. And that includes healthcare, education, water, clean water, sanitation, and so on. And so the fact that it is that way now, makes this pandemic much more complicated to handle. So that is sort of a longer-term challenge to try to correct this situation. Now, the second aspect that I think is very important, key, is the issue of financing. You saw how capital is moving out of developing countries. So often the governments that are making all these investments in the short run, these fiscal policies, and government in the long run and would need to make this infrastructure investment, for example, well, where are they going to get the finance? Certainly the private sector doesn't seem to be going into developing countries, they're moving out. So it would be the government. And so you would have these huge budget deficits that are already expanding. We have seen it and it will continue. So at some point it generates a risk of sovereign debt crisis. And I should say that it's not just the government. As capital flows out of many economies, the private sector struggles as well. And so you may have governments having to get involved in bailouts of the private sector. And I should point out that this was in October of 2019. The IMF was concerned because of all the trade conflicts that maybe there was some kind of slowdown in 2020. This could have a severe impact on the world economy. And so in October of 2019, this is what they said. They said, well, in the event of a crisis in 2020, which they had no idea, but in the event of a crisis, they said corporate debt, private sector corporate debt at risk of default would rise to $19 trillion, or nearly 40% of the total debt in 8 major economies, the 8 largest economies in the world. This is above the level seen during the financial crisis. And so this is public-private debt growing. And so international organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, they know this, and they're already gearing for this storm that you can see ahead. So they're talking about debt restructurings and forgiveness, debt service suspensions, and so on. All of these, I mean, right now, maybe people are working in the background, but I mean, this is in the medium term, this is what is going to happen. And so this will require a substantial multilateral cooperation. Now, the other thing, or the third sort of question mark here, which also generates a lot of uncertainty, is that we have an issue with public and even private sector governance in many countries. And so it's not clear that these policies will be effectively implemented, if at all, given the situation in many developing countries. Brazil comes to mind, sort of to the forefront, but there's so many others. So in many developing countries and in the United States. And so that's a question, whether that governance will improve. Now, let me just conclude by saying that if these appropriate policy actions are carried out, of course, the consequences of the pandemic in the medium term, maybe in the long term, will be ameliorated. They will be reduced. And so the global economy before the COVID-19 crisis appeared to be finally recovering from the great financial crisis that we had in 2008, 2009. And although we cannot really be as optimistic as Jason Furman said before, we'll have this great recovery. Economies will recover gradually, slowly, will be more like a U, as you saw a forecast by the IMF before. And even in trade, yes, in the short run, we'll see this decline of trade. That's no question about it, sharp drop of trade. But the forces of globalization and of trade are there. Comparative advantage really hasn't changed that much. It still favors developing countries, particularly the very low income countries. And so you see a lot of investment going into Vietnam. First it was China, but now Vietnam, maybe Southeast Asia, and maybe even Africa in terms of movement of capital and production into low-wage developing countries. Now, of course, we all know that automation and artificial intelligence may slow down this process, but I don't think it will stop globalization. In terms of migration flows, you know, in high-income countries, people are getting older, the residents, and so these will eventually provide again an incentive for a rebound of migration. And in developing countries, you see in general, policymakers recognizing the value of trade, of globalization. It's not just the countries that are commodity exporters and of course rely enormously on trade, but those, of course, like China, which engage in manufacturing, those exporting agricultural products, those that have a lot of migrants in the rest of the world and receive tens of billions of dollars in remittances from these workers, the increasing sale of services across borders, countries like India and so on, which, by the way, they do a lot of trading health services, and so on. All the forces that are behind globalization, which I would argue they're also behind the process of, but are likely to continue, especially if there is some attention paid, as I said before, to this issue of inequality. So globalization is likely to rebound. And I think it actually required for the global economy to rebound. So let me just conclude by, you know, I think probably most of you have seen this quote, but back in the 19th century, we had this very celebrated American writer, Mark Twain, who was 62 years old at the time when a rumor appeared in the papers and everything that he had died, you know. So someone in New York, in a New York newspaper, contacted him at home to ask whether he had died. And so he actually answered the journalist himself, and he replied, well, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. So I think the reports of the death of globalization may also be greatly exaggerated. So that's what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you. Are we ready for the Q&A?
Yes, of course, yes.
All right. So if you would like to ask a question, make a comment, go down to the left-hand side under participants to raise your hand. We have 2 hands up. Let's see, Sergey.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, first of all, the Picker Center for organizing this event. And I'd like to thank you, Professor Rivera-Batiz. I was lucky enough to take your class last summer, one of the best in the program, I should say. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for the great paper. I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one has to do with the fiscal policy. As you know, this country, for instance, could give like $2 trillion to people as a sort of rescue package. And the European countries, some European countries have done the same in this crisis because it's really an unprecedented crisis. It's exogenous. We've never seen anything like that before, at least in recent times. But there's also another school of thought. For instance, in my country, in Russia, the government decided not to do anything despite of big reserves from oil trade. They, when asked why you don't want to help the people, although the people are like locked down as in other countries, the government pretty much says that, I mean, they eventually they helped, but not enough, definitely. And what they say is, you know what, we're not the United States, we're not a reserve country, a reserve currency country, and we cannot afford to just give money like that, because otherwise we'll have to print money, like simply put, and that will spiral inflation, et cetera, and the economy as it is not in a good shape. So does that make sense? And if it does, then it's a little bit scary, because as I've seen other emerging countries, other developing countries do pretty much the same. They don't help much. They don't do, they don't give rescue packages to the population. Then if the second or third wave, God forbid, happens, what will they do? And my second question, I'm so sorry, just very quick. You rightly pointed out in your paper about the international financial institutions and their possible role, because in the end, those countries, developing countries, will go to them for help. But I'm wondering, because in the financial crises of the late 90s, the US economy was in a different shape, right? And the Clinton administration was eager to contribute to the IMF, even when the IMF made some mistakes, you know, and threw money on the crisis. But this is very different. This time is very different. Neither the United States nor European countries are very eager to contribute to international institutions, including the IFIs. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
Yes, well, let me answer both questions. Actually, the second one may have a little bit also to do with the first one. But in terms of fiscal policy, of course, given the situation, you don't really have a lot of tax revenues to finance those expenditures. So either you borrow or you print money. Now, print money is the easy way to do it. And of course, that's what has been happening to a great extent. And that's, you know, both the impacts of monetary policy and fiscal policy depend a lot on the economy. And you're right, there are some economies which are in situations already of high inflation. And those economies cannot afford to print money either as an expansionary monetary policy or in the form of financing the budget deficits of a government. So those countries are in a bit of a pickle, like Venezuela, for example. You know, it's just with a hyperinflation, even if it's declining hyperinflation, you can have the hyperinflation go back up. So that's the issue. Now, in many economies, however, even many developing countries, certainly the industrial countries, we don't have a situation of inflation. So we have a situation of deflation. And so whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy, which is financed basically by printing money. Essentially, I think the United States is doing that right now. They say they don't do it, but in fact, the Federal Reserve is purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars of treasury bonds, which are financing, you know, the growing budget deficit of the federal government. So and the same in other high-income countries. And that is I think it is the appropriate policy to follow, because there is no danger of inflation. If anything, the danger is of deflation. And deflation has its own problems as well. Because no company wants to have declining prices. They're not going to invest and whatever. So economists point out of the problems of deflation. So it's better to actually create some inflation. You know, the usual target zone is about 2%, you know, inflation a year or something. But right now in many countries, prices are maybe even going down. You know, there may be a deflation in terms of sort of annual rates of inflation. But you're right, there are some countries, and so this is a country by country situation where expanding fiscal policies would be a disaster. And those, I would say, are countries which are in difficulties right now. They've had already a lot of government spending, and they have inflation, and so that's right. Now, in terms of the international financial institutions, well, there are two ways of financing these institutions. One, as you mentioned, is to increase the funding from the member countries, and certainly the countries, high-income industrial countries. And you're completely right that we have a problem right now because the Trump administration is not going to do that, and the European Union, it's involved in its own expansion in terms of expansionary fiscal policies. So now, but there is a second way of doing it, which is just to create money. And the IMF is the only international organization that has the ability to create money, to create its money, which is the SDR, the special drawing rights. And so that was indeed the role that was given to this international money decades ago, but basically under the Bretton Woods system, was to create global liquidity. And so the IMF was given that authority. And so they can just increase the supply of special drawing rights and distribute that into different countries, particularly in emerging markets. And that proposal is right there, and I'm sure it will be implemented because they're already gearing up. They understand that if you look at their website, they're already saying, well, we're growing our ability to lend, and we're ready to start lending. And I think they will expand the supply of SDRs in order to do that. And I think they need to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just a note, if you can keep, for those asking questions, if you can keep it shorter so we get more questions in, that would be great. Next we have Mark Goldner.
Thank you, Professor. Really fascinating topic. I love your background, by the way, global trade. So I think you had a really interesting point on the third wave and like kind of what will happen with education. And I saw you had water purification in there, clean water, and a lot of the charts were very memorable. I guess I had two questions. The first was really about like the globalization aspect and why you think so many people think globalization is dying when essentially globalization is what has allowed the advanced world economies to prosper in the first place. And the second is about how debt is being restructured. So not only for FDIs, but also how private companies and especially foreign entities owned by governments are now getting into the private space where, like yesterday is just a good example of how Cirque du Soleil is filing for bankruptcy and they're restructuring all this debt when they don't even have employees anymore. They have 5% of their old employees. So how will that wind up impacting the next wave of investments and entrepreneurial ventures or like big businesses?
Great, thank you. So for the first question, it is very easy to get discouraged about whether globalization will rebound or not. Before the crisis, we of course had a period which hit global trade negatively in two ways. Well, we had the global financial crisis, and then we had as well this period of conflict, of trade conflicts and trade wars and so on. A lot of it associated with economic nationalism, whether it's here in the United States with President Trump or in other countries as well. But the reality is that, if you talk to any business, they understand the role of trade and of investment, and so these fundamental forces generating globalization are there. In the short run, of course, when we have a collapse of commerce like we have now, you have a reduction in trade, but doesn't mean that the forces of globalization are not there. And so they will come up again. And so that's why I'm sort of optimistic that globalization will continue. There are always very popular voices, both in high-income countries, as I said, with this new economic nationalism that we see, but also in developing countries as well. Which I think it is a minority, but it's very vocal minority. So you see now in high-income countries the extreme right, with this economic nationalism, but traditional in developing countries, you have the extreme left, which has been also against globalization. And again, I think it's not a majority of the population, but it's a very vocal minority, which has criticized globalization and so on, sort of focusing on the negative aspects of globalization. But see, any economic policy, anything as we talked about, even with expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy, has some potential negative effects. So the question is whether the balance of the effects is positive. And I think most economists would argue that the balance of the effects of globalization has been positive. If there is some impact in terms of greater inequality or whatever, there are other policies that can be used to deal with that. They have not, but it's not the problem of globalization necessarily. I'm sure that you have all these very well meaning very rich people, opera and, Pavarotti and so on. They sell, Pavarotti is dead, but I saw his inheritance. I mean, it's a huge amount of money they get by selling all this stuff in different countries. If you have an innovation, the fact that you have greater markets means that you can become very rich because of this. But it is the really function of governments and the responsibility maybe to tax this, and so that it can make it available so that more people can become rich. And that's what is not happening. But just to sort of destroy the golden goose, which may be globalization, maybe it's the wrong approach. You have to sort of deal with whatever negative consequences. And I think that has been the failure. And why you do have some people who think, well, let's just kill globalization because it may not have this effect or this positive effect, and simply may have destroyed, this community or these sectors, and so. So that's why you see a lot of negative views and perceptions on globalization. But the fact is that, if you look at country after country and you have policymakers, they understand, if you're in power, that trade in high incomes and in developing countries is a huge force. That you can talk, but the reality is that it's essential for economic growth. And as I said, it's not just it's everywhere. Right now in Spain, they have a big problem because there is a Nissan factory which is closing. I think in the Basque region, I'm not sure where, but they're firing basically about 3,000 or 4,000 workers. It's a huge plant. And so the workers, the unions are upset, because they're being fired. They said, well, maybe we can keep, this factory open. Maybe the government can negotiate with Nissan, but that's globalization. That's part of globalization. All these workers are employed in Spain because of the foreign investments of this foreign company. So that's, that's my answer on that. Was there a second question there?
Yeah, I was just curious. Thank you, though. That was very, very interesting. The question was more so about like how debt will be restructured in the future, and not just like from like FDI or governments, but also private investments, and how that will either spur or contract entrepreneurial ventures versus like big businesses, and how kind of that shape.
Yes, well, I think you bring a good point, which is that and part of these longer run effects is technological change and innovation is a big fact behind economic growth. And when you have a situation like you have now, with the uncertainty and with the lack of financing and so on, I think the crisis is going to have a very negative effect on innovation. particularly because innovation, requires a lot of venture capital. And so, and this, it's just the public sector, as you say, it's the private sector everywhere. It's having a lot of difficulties. So all I can say is that it will require a lot of imagination to handle these crises because we have combinations of, someone, I think in one of the articles that I was reading is calling it a perfect storm. But the thing is that there were many weak sectors of the economy in high income and developing countries before the crisis. And they were just beginning to sort of recover. I mean, this great financial crisis was a disaster. And so as, they were beginning to recover, then are hit with this crisis. And so you have a lot of sectors, the service sector, for instance, which you will have a set of bankruptcies, and the service sector includes these major retailers, like Sears and Macy's. You have the airlines. You have some very big companies here. And so, handling the growing debt, because these companies are losing billions and billions of dollars, will require a lot of thinking about it. Someone will have to write a paper about that topic alone.
Thank you. Next we have Terrence. Terrence.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terrence Hawley Fraser. I'm a tax lawyer with the Treasury Department, and I'm an incoming student for the fall semester in the EMPA program. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me on this meeting. And thank you, Professor Rivera. I have read your article. I think it's very interesting. It's very educational. And I'm very happy that you shared it with us. Thanks again. I just have a quick question. And the question is, could you speak a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy of Africa in particular? The African continent it's both it's an undeveloped as well as a developing continent in various parts. So the African continent has been impacted with the virus and will continue to be impacted with the virus. So can you talk a little bit about what would you suggest? What should Africa do to ameliorate the effects of COVID-19, which I think Africa might be in a little bit of a more peculiar position because of, I guess, the demographics of the country and the population and the impoverished nature of the African economy. So can you elaborate on that, please? I would appreciate it. And thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. There's several things. One is I think that the pandemic is going to sort of grow in Africa, unfortunately, over the next few months. It has hit a little bit later than in other countries. These pandemics start with international contacts, contacts from other countries, tourism, and so on, and linkages that exist. So I think Africa is actually beginning this process now. That's why you see in New York City there was this early start, is because of all the linkages, all the tourism, all the linkages with the rest of the world. And now it's expanding to other parts of the United States. And I think you will see that in Africa. In some parts of Africa, you have something severe as well, because they have greater linkages, tourism and so on. But that of course, will inevitably expand over the next few months to other countries and to the rest of the countries where it has already started. So Africa is not going to avoid this crisis. It will continue, and it will be made worse by the issues that I mentioned before, the inequality, poverty, and so on, which basically mean lack of access to health care facilities, a shortage of healthcare facilities, and so on. And so this will tend to make the crisis worse. Now, in terms of the solutions, again, I talked about a set of solutions, and they apply very clearly to Africa as well, especially to countries that have seen a lot of growth of inequality, and where you do have substantial economic growth, but it has not sparked a greater equality, greater infrastructure in terms of health care, in terms of sanitation, and so on. It hasn't happened, and so in countries, like Angola or Nigeria or Equatorial Guinea, you see a lot of countries where they have had substantial economic growth. They have a lot of natural resources, for example, but you don't see those increased investments in infrastructure, in health, infrastructure, social safety nets, and so on, which, as I mentioned before, in general, would make a big difference in terms of the impact of the pandemic. In terms of health, in terms of economics, again, the problem is a lot of African countries are in great debt already, in terms of public sector debt. And so once you hit, there's not a lot of room there as you increase the sovereign debt to have very climbing sort of spreads, which are higher interest rates, basically, that you have to pay in terms of increased borrowing. And therefore, eventually, perhaps even very soon, they will run out of possibilities to borrow in private financial, private sector financial markets. And so they will have to rely on the IMF or other multilateral organizations to get loans for just to survive in terms of public spending, and definitely in terms of infrastructure investments. Now, the infrastructure investments, that's the bread and butter of the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and all these international organizations. So that's where you would have sort of to rely for this type of loans. But that is this sovereign debt crisis of the government. I think that's the next stage. We're talking about over the remainder of the year, next year. I think that's the next stage of the crisis. And so that's where policies need to be oriented. And that's certainly in Africa, where you have countries suffering right now already from very high levels of debt or ratios of debt to GDP. Now, underlying all of these, remember what I said, is public sector governance. And so that's a problem. Countries that have very good public sector governance, like Botswana, for example, they have had a great record of economic growth, and probably they will be able to handle this pandemic very well. But you have very bad governance in a number of other countries, in Africa and everywhere in the world, in developing countries and in the United States. That's a tricky question. That's difficult because this is not something that can be dealt so quickly. Changes in governance. I should say that they can be changed quickly. There are cases. And I can tell you the policies that were adopted, but you need governments that are willing to engage in these policies to have improved governance. And that's the tricky question. because either you have authoritarian governments or then you have democracies, but these democracies are, they're influenced by a number of interests, and so you really never end up with good governance. And that, no matter what the loans provided by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, or even the private sector, it ends up basically, eventually, they have to be managed by local authorities, and so that is a key issue, as well. But that's really, I don't think it's complicated in terms of, as an economist, I can tell you, well, these are the things that you need to do, and this is how they did it here and how they did it there, and they improved governance in a few years. But how do you get that? The only way is to have a new leadership in the country that is willing to make those reforms, and it's not so easy to do that. And so that's sort of a longer term problem.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor. I really appreciate that. I wish I could stay longer, but I work for the government and I need to go to another meeting. And when Uncle Sam come to me, we all have to go to Uncle Sam. So I really appreciate your explanation, and hopefully I'll see you in the fall.
Yes, and thank you, and keep those checks coming. Huh?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
coming.
So
Bye-bye.
we have two more questions. Well, two questions from the chat, from students who don't have access to audio. So I'm just going to read them out. From Ozan Volkan. He says, you covered the global trade and economics aspect of the pandemic economics perfectly. Could you also please share your thoughts about the global finance capital markets aspect of the situation? We have huge collapses in aggregate demand, inflation, and income. Yet some point out to financial market bubbles due to monetary stimulus. How does the financial market aspect of the pandemic play out? Thank you.
Yes, well, actually, very good question. And so I have basically a couple of issues here. Number one, I mean, these global financial markets are in a lot of stress right now, particularly as it involves the finance. I mean, I presented some data relating to that, but specifically, there's the financing available to outside the United States and to many developing countries. There is a dollar shortage in world financial markets, a huge dollar shortage. Even central banks in many countries, they don't have, they're running out of their reserves. The East Asian countries, China and Korea and so on, of course, they have a huge amount of reserves, and probably was a good idea to have these huge dollar reserves, which they're using right now. But in countries that do not have such huge international reserves of basically dollars, they have had to engage in liquidity swaps with the Federal Reserve, where basically the Federal Reserve allows them to have a bunch of dollars available on an immediate basis because of this dollar shortage. But the dollar shortage happens because the financial markets, the global financial markets, also have a dollar shortage. And where does that dollar shortage come from? Well, a lot of the dollars are flowing back into the United States. They're moving away from these financial markets. And so we know this happened as well during and after the global financial crisis. So these markets are having a lot of stress, and so the lending that happens to stimulate world trade and to stimulate world investment, which is a lot of it happens in dollars by American institutions and other institutions that lend dollars in Chile or in Africa and everywhere in the world. They're having a lot of difficulties trying to be able to supply this finance, and of course this has domino effects in terms of local businesses that have these problems. Now, the other thing that is happening, of course, is that the uncertainty that we have gives rise to this psychology. The psychology in financial markets is that it can be run one way or another way, two different ways. But one is that because we have so much uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen. The stock markets crash. You have these fears of what's going to happen in the future, and that's what happened in the United States. I mean, we still didn't know much at the beginning of the pandemic, and so you had this huge stock market crash. Well, it was sort of a bubble, leading to this crash, and then of course it can happen the other way, and so you have a little bit of quantitative easing and a little bit of expansionary monetary and fiscal policy, and then the stock market prices, there's a bubble up in terms of prices. And this already has been mentioned by Robert Shiller and other economists, financial economists, and it's also a danger as well, because at any moment that there's a set of bad news, you could have a stock market crash again because of what we had. And this is always a danger in September and October. These are 2 months where everybody, all investors and so on, sort of beginning to consider investment for the following year and the end of the year and so on. And so there are a lot of crashes that happen in the stock market crashes in September and October, and so you have to be very careful during this time period. And as I said, unfortunately, at least in the United States, of course, the Federal Reserve seems to be adequately managed, but the rest of the government, the quality of the governance is not the best. So we could have something like that happen. So there are a lot of dangers because of the uncertainty, and the uncertainty is real, but it's also generated by how financial markets operate, their psychology. And we're subject to that as well. And these bubbles, or when the bubbles burst, they can have tremendous impact, even in the short run, in terms of an economy and in terms of investments, real investments. So all this ends up in Main Street eventually. The lack of access to dollar financing, the bubbles, all these eventually ends up affecting Main Street. So thank you for the question. Yes.
Thank you. So we have one more question from the chat, and then I'll have Bill would like to ask a question as well. So is that all right with you? We're over time, but
yeah, that's fine.
All right. So this is from Kenneth Lewis. Professor, do you anticipate that cryptocurrencies will play any role in helping developing countries, in particular, cope with the after effects of the pandemic? For example, increasing access to the financial system or providing alternatives to volatile currencies as a store of value?
Well, the future of these cryptocurrencies is no question that they will continue to expand. The problem that right now it's very limited, and a lot of the interest in these cryptocurrencies is speculative in nature. And that's because the markets are they're growing, they're small, and that's usually what happens. There's a lot of uncertainty. When there is a lot of uncertainty, of course, there is room there to take risk and to profit from those risks. So I myself wouldn't invest, in cryptocurrencies because of the uncertainty. The prices can go up and then they can collapse and then they go up again, and you don't know when. And they're very susceptible to possible policy changes. Some central banks and governments don't like them and may regulate it, and we don't know what is going to happen with that. So on the one hand, you have this uncertainty that creates a lot of fluctuation in the values of these cryptocurrencies. On the other hand, as I said, I think these currencies have a lot of future, especially in countries where you have currencies which are a disaster, currencies which are depreciating in value, where you do have a lot of inflation. And so people are looking for alternatives. Now, alternatives normally are dollars, but dollars, again, as I said, it's a shortage of dollars. The dollar has been appreciating in value over the last several years, and it doesn't seem to go down. And every time there is a crisis, there is a movement to the dollar as a safe haven. And so the value of the dollar keeps increasing despite all the expansionary monetary policies. The Federal Reserve keeps pumping dollars. But the banks keep holding, those dollars. They don't use them, because they're scared, because of the crisis. If there is a shortage of dollars, then people are looking for other currencies, and cryptocurrencies is a way out, and they are already a way out in Venezuela or in other countries which have collapsing currencies. So I see, and definitely countries which have similar types of situations would definitely benefit, and local businesses in the belt would benefit from having these cryptocurrencies. The only problem is that they are small markets still, and so there is a lot of risk involved. And so for transaction purposes, yes, I think they will grow. As a sort of investment and so on, there's a lot of speculative aspects involved. And in terms of the long run, it depends on how governments will react. Because it's, economists call it currency substitution. It's that people start using alternative currencies because their sovereign currencies are depreciating or they're losing value, and so on. So many governments, they don't like that. And so it's possible that then they will regulate it, and then your investment will disappear. But I think they're the future, certainly in countries where there is a lot of uncertainty.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to?
Well, it's such a great session, and we're so appreciative. I feel guilty about asking you to stay for one last question, but I'll try to be brief. Let's try to see if we can end on an optimistic note. Let's assume that AstraZeneca is right and they have 2 billion doses of vaccine in October. Let's assume Trump loses the election and we have a multiracial Democratic team that has a history with the Obama administration, and they come to power with overwhelming Lyndon Johnson kind of victory in the election and commit themselves to getting the economy moving again, that there's a stimulus package that is enacted in September because the Congress is all up for re-election and they're going to want to buy votes. So all those things are set, and now the world is sort of feeling optimistic, and there are other vaccines coming on the market. It's my observation that the powers that be have been very effective in scaring the world population about COVID. Not everybody's gotten the message, but a lot of people have taken the message to extremes, wearing face masks in their house and never venturing out, and on and on and on. You mentioned a lot in your paper, uncertainty. What can be done, assuming all my optimistic things are right, to turn the general public, the global general public, around to trust again that the world is safe to go back to normal? Who are the trusted voices? Who could speak that truth, assuming the truth is true, that there's a vaccine, that we're on top of it, that the economy's coming back, let's get back to our lives?
Well, the problem is that we're lacking the leadership that would be able to generate that message. In terms of the United States, where you have right now this sort of the center of the pandemic, other countries, of course, the population in the United States and in other countries would be able to have some reassurance that things will not be as bad if we had the leadership in the United States, the president of the United States, actually talking about science and talking about reality. The problem is that I'm not sure if the credibility has been lost so much that no one really believes what the president or the White House say, and they have a lot of voice. Believe me, I follow the news in other countries, particularly in Spanish countries, and throughout this period, they always have coverage of Trump. And so when you hear about people telling people, well, drink a little bit of Clorox, and that will take care of it, people are listening everywhere. So I think at this point, we have a problem in that a lot of the leadership, at least in terms of the United States, and in other countries as well. I mean, Brazil is a very large country, has a big influence also in Latin America. And the situation there as well with the leadership is a disaster. You know, we have leaders with very little credibility. As you say, that could change in November. Well, that's a long time, you know, from now through November. And through that time period, basically people, as you say, they are scared. And there is the psychology. I mentioned the psychology could be negative, it could be positive when you have these bubbles, but it could go the other way. And it has been going the other way in terms of being negative bubbles over the last few months. Certainly the stock market crash was much greater than justified by what was happening at the beginning of this pandemic. But that could happen again if there are, again, some negative things happening, and you know, there is no leadership to reassure the U.S. economy and the world economy as well. Now, and that there is no other, unfortunately, there are no other leaders. I don't think the leadership in China would be able to take charge. They could, but I don't think they can. You know, they lied at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, they're very secretive in the things that they do and so on. So it's not like either you have sort of other figures in the world, other countries, whether it's China, Russia, or Brazil, or any of these countries. You have leaders there that would be focusing on the signs and calming down people in these situations where you do have these negative bubbles, which we know are already happening. So I cannot tell you what to do, because I think that's the most important thing. That's what I listen to the experts and to those in power. Unfortunately, we don't have that leadership. You can say, oh, okay, yes, well, we developed this vaccine and it will come out. But nowadays, because people have lied so much and these leaders have lied so much, you know, but not as many people really believe, you know, that this is happening. I don't see any way. There was an opportunity there to do that, to have very serious, you know, communication with the public, but that didn't happen. And now I think it's, you know, it's a lost opportunity.
But you're still hopeful.
Well, I'm hopeful. You know, it's again, there is so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
You know, as I said at the end, you know, I had all these, you know, the economists, we're always sort of the dismal signs, we're always sort of focusing on the negative. And that seems to be the best forecast. But I think underlying all of my presentation and even at the end is, you know, there is a lot of uncertainty. And certainly before this happened, the world economy seemed to be going into a period of expansion. Things seem to be positive finally after many years. And, you know, these forces that are there in terms of economic forces, they're still there, lying, you know, to resurface, including globalization. And I think they will rebound. But there is a lot of uncertainty how long that will take.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tremendous presentation.
Oh, thank you.
We're very grateful. Thank you so much.